What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Devil's Reign. Now, picking up from the end of last week's video, right, the last issue, this basically takes place 2 weeks after the attempt of what you could kind of call the Secret Avengers, I guess. They don't officially have a name, they're just calling themselves the Avengers, but basically their attempt on Wilson Fisk, if anything, to take the life of Wilson Fisk, right, to take him down. Of course, they proved to be unsuccessful, but what this did is it basically emboldened Wilson Fisk, right, in the sense that now they've got drones out there that are basically always on the hunt for these differing members of the Avengers, as well as anybody who either has information or anybody who may have some kind of powers out there. The other part of this is that Wilson Fisk has heavily fortified the entirety of the mayoral office, right, where he resides. So now it's one of these things where, in a lot of ways, because of the actions of the superheroes, they've almost kind of pushed the city of New York into becoming a militarized zone, right? It's kind of crazy. But regardless, of course, you end up having Wilson Fisk, who's met by the arrival of Dr. Octopus, right, who has, of course, his other octopus henchmen and so on and so forth. And it's one of those funny things, because in the end, Wilson Fisk kind of asks him, like, you have what's basically a Hulk and like a Wolverine and a Ghost Rider and yourself. Why don't you just come take the throne of mayor for me? And the response of Otto is just basically saying, like, because it means nothing to me, right? Like, why would I go through all that time and all that energy and all that effort to kill you in order to become mayor, right? I've got like much bigger things that I'm focusing on besides that. And it's kind of this funny thing, right? Because he says, like, you've always been obsessed with power, Wilson Fisk, right? And I'm happy to have you basically sit in a useless seat to shake hands and kiss babies. He's like, but I am working on making the world a better place, right? I'm working on much bigger things. The technology in the Baxter building following Reed Richards' arrest has basically given me like marvelous technologies that I can use for my own ends, right? That made all these Octobots possible and all that kind of stuff. At the end of the day, you're focusing on small stuff, as you always do, because you're a small-minded person. I'm focusing on big things. And he says also something that you should be aware of. He's like, in the end, we have basically continued to deliver, we want to deliver this news that like crime is again down in the city of New York, which means we've arrested your son Butch, and then basically leaves. Now, following that, Matt Murdock, of course, goes to basically visit Foggy Nelson. Remember, because Foggy Nelson is basically the lawyer for Luke Cage, and Luke Cage announced his candidacy for mayor of the city of New York to run against Wilson Fisk, because from the Avengers' perspective, it's the only real way to get Fisk out of his position, that if they were to successfully assassinate him, he would basically become a martyr, and he would prove them right? He would prove himself right in saying that Avengers or superheroes are just too dangerous, because it's literally superheroes assassinated a political official, right? That's not something to be done lightly. Of course, Foggy Nelson was basically beat up by henchmen of Wilson Fisk in order to basically send a message. Now, the funny thing about this is that Foggy Nelson, as those of you guys who are familiar with Daredevil, Foggy Nelson doesn't take lip off anybody. And so it's one of those things where it's like, okay, I mean, yeah, I get what they were trying to do, but like, they're gonna have to try harder than that. This whole Catholic guilt that you have, Matt Murdock of, well, Foggy, I never should have involved you, and I put you in harm's way. Stuff it, right? And even he's just like, I absolve you, my son. Now get out of here, right? Like, go do your thing. It's one of the things I always loved about Foggy Nelson, right? But in the midst of that, of course, as Matt Murdock is leaving, he's met by the arrival of his twin brother, Mike Murdock. Now, as a bit of a refresher here, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with Mike Murdock, we did discuss him before, so we won't go super in-depth here, that basically there was a point where Matt Murdock had brought together a team of Inhumans to essentially find a way, or at least brought together a team of people, which included Inhumans, to find a way to defeat Wilson Fisk. One of those was a person named Reader, who could basically manifest anything he read, and that in researching Matt Murdock and seeing the identity of Mike Murdock, this led to him accidentally creating Mike Murdock. Now, the reason why we've never really talked about him before, the reason why we've never really addressed him before is because, in all honesty, Marvel will probably get rid of him pretty soon, especially when you get around to the point where like the Netflix Daredevil series starts to launch. Marvel's probably going to kill off Mike Murdock, right? So, we can do a video on him if you guys are particularly interested, but right now there's just not really a reason to. I don't see him lasting much longer in Marvel Comics. And so it's just one of those things where you kind of switch over to Wilson Fisk himself. And because of what's going on here, one of the things to remember in the last video that we discussed, or that we did, that you have the Purple Man, Zebediah Killgrave, right? A person who has the ability to emit pheromones that can basically make people do whatever it is that he wants them to do, so long as their willpower isn't too high, or they don't have any kind of like telepathic protection or anything along those lines. But there was also the Purple Man's children, and that his children are the other half of this puzzle. The powers of the Purple Man only only goes so far. But if Wilson Fisk has the powers of his kids and the powers of Purple Man, then he would be nigh unstoppable. And he kind of has his sights set on the office of the presidency. Now remember, the entire motivation for why Wilson Fisk is doing this is because somewhere along the line, basically Matt Murdock had done something to make him forget Daredevil's identity. It's a personal grudge. The reality of this, and like the equivalent of what's going on here, is if like your worst enemy in the world came to you and basically said that they were able to successfully do something to like defeat you in some capacity, and you had no real recourse. That's what this is the equivalent of, right? It's basically Kingpin essentially boxing Matt Murdock in, saying, okay, fine, if you are going to strip me of the knowledge of your identity against my will, right? You're going to screw with my head, then that's fine. I will screw with your life, and not just your life, the lives of everybody around you. This is really nothing more than a personal grudge. That's something to understand here, right? This is not Wilson Fisk genuinely doing the good thing and believing he can actually make the world better. No, everything he's doing here, harnessing the power of the Purple Man, setting his sights on the office of the presidency, it's all to basically get back at Matt Murdock, is really all it is, right? And so basically he ends up bringing together the Thunderbolts. So you got like John Walker, you've got Rhino, right? You've got the new Electro, all that kind of stuff. And it's one of these things, something to keep in mind, the Thunderbolts are really more anti-heroes than they are straight up villains. They're basically, people who were at some point in line, maybe good guys, kind of not good guys, and have a questionable past. Well, I guess when I say that, I'm really more referencing John Walker. These guys have always they've always kind of been bad guys. I mean, to a degree with John Walker, he's a little more anti-hero, right? He, the Commission on Superhuman Activities basically replaced Captain America with him, and then he lost his mind, and that led to him just like, basically being stripped of his powers, and then the mantle of Captain America going back to Steve Rogers. But it's one of those things where like what Wilson Fisk is asking them to do here is to basically find the purple children. And that's where the villains really kind of draw the line. It's one of the things about Marvel's villains, right? Very rarely do you ever find a Marvel villain who will do whatever they need to do, right? Who will do anything and everything. They have a few of them, like Taskmaster is a good example, right? You pay Taskmaster to kill a person, he will kill them. It doesn't really matter who they are, right? Like he will kill that person. Frank Castle to a degree, but only when it comes to villains, right? Marvel really kind of shies away from this idea that like villains will kill kids. They really sort of, they don't really deal with that all too often, and rightfully so. And so it's one of these things where literally John Walker's like, I mean, look, I need to know what these kids did, right? I mean, why are we going after them? And so what he ends up doing, or at least what Kingpin does, is he invokes the power of the Purple Man and says like, you will do what I tell you to do, Mr. Walker. And then of course, with Walker's willpower really kind of being lower than it needs to be to withstand the powers of the Purple Man, ends up going alongside that instead. And so of course, again, following that, you basically pick up with who is in effect the wife of Wilson Fisk at this point in time, Typhoid Mary. Of course, we'll talk about her here in a little bit. What you actually end up doing is switching over to the prison where all the various superheroes are being held, where essentially Susan Storm, using her powers to make herself invisible, having picked the lock on her collar, right? Because she had an inhibitor collar, but she ended up taking a paperclip when she was meeting with her attorney, and now has used that to free herself, and then in turn steals like one of the passes off one of the guards as they walk by, and then frees Reed Richards, and then basically frees, opens up all the other cells, which allows all the heroes to escape. Here's the thing about this, right? On the surface, you could look at that and call this a plot device. It's actually not. So Susan Storm is ridiculously capable, right? I mean, one of the things to understand here, you're talking about a woman whose power to create force fields can withstand the power of Celestials. So it's no small thing. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility to believe that she could basically use a paperclip to pick a lock on her inhibitor collar. What this is also designed to do is illustrate the idiocy of just your average person in comparison to the Fantastic Four. And the reason why I say that is if you go back and you look at the events of Civil War, when the idea of creating a prison for those who wouldn't follow superhuman registration was created or developed by like Reed and Tony and Hank Pym, really Reed more than anybody else, that Reed's first thought was, we're going to be arresting some pretty heavy hitters, whether they have super strength or they have intangibility or anything like that. So it's not enough to put them in a prison. We have to put that prison in a place that they can't escape from. And that's why Prison 42 during Civil War was located in the negative zone, so that even if they somehow did manage to escape the prison, where are they going to go? That's one of the things you kind of run into here, is that in this instance, literally they locked up all these superheroes and they just put them in a prison in the water. And like, that was it, right? It's kind of like, okay, in the end, like a prison break is going to happen, especially when like two of the people you have locked up, right? Like Reed Richards and Tony Stark are two of the absolute smartest people in the entirety of the Marvel universe. And so again, great big huge fight breaks out, and basically they end up, seemingly being able to overtake the prison guards and start engineering their own escape. Now, one of the things that goes on here, and it's kind of intriguing, is that you do have like the champions, right? So you've got like Ironheart Bernard, and you've got Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, and you got like Viv, right, like Vision's daughter, which honestly, I feel like we should get caught up on the Champions. I haven't read them in so long, but their comics were just fun, right? It was like Marvel's Teen Titans, but better. It was just great. I just loved it, right? There's a great big huge fight, even with Miles, right? There's a great big huge fight where like they're all involved in a conflict with Rhino, and it's one of those things where like Rhino basically is like, he's here and he was like, look, like put on these, like basically put on these discs, right? Like put on these things. And ultimately when that happens, the bots themselves or the drones are basically designed in such a way to where they don't attack anybody with a Thunderbolt badge. And when the question is asked, Rhino, why are you giving us Thunderbolt badges so these drones won't attack us? The response of Rhino is, look, like, I know I'm a bad guy, right? Like, I have not done very good things over the course of my life. I've basically just been a horrible human being. Anytime you ever saw me, I was committing some kind of a crime. But what Wilson Fisk is asking us to do, to find some kids and to bring those kids in who seemingly haven't done anything wrong, not even I can follow those orders, right? Not even I can abide that, right? It's just, that's a line that I just want crossed. It's cool. It's a great little thing. I mean, is this like a Rhino redemption arc? No. It's just basically designed to illustrate that the kinds of things that Wilson Fisk is asking people to do are things that not even villains are willing to do. More so than that, it's showing there's trouble in paradise, right? The foundations by which Wilson Fisk is building his empire were never stable to begin with. And now that instability is showing in the fact that it's starting to crack. So it's really, really awesome to see. What you also end up getting in the aftermath of this is that Miles basically ends up racing off to the rest of the Avengers and then telling them, like, Kingpin is after the purple children, right? He's after the kids of the Purple Man. And that while I was told by Rhino, and sure, I guess Rhino's not necessarily the most credible force, the guy saved our life, right? He could kill us all with the greatest of ease if he chose to, but he saved us. And so if this is true, and Wilson Fisk is going after the Purple Children, having them under his control, being able to use their powers, he'll dominate the world, right? He'll be able to take everything over. And so it's one of those crazy things, because what you end up getting here is, this is just a crazy moment. You switch over to Wilson Fisk, and Wilson Fisk, of course, always having the staff next to him, which basically allows him to channel the powers of the Purple Man, is met by Typhoid Mary. Now, Typhoid Mary, she's been around in Daredevil comics for a long time. She's had some great story arcs and she's had some awful story arcs. She's like every comic book character ever. She's never had like 100% great arcs 100% of the time. That never happens. But Typhoid Mary is a person who basically has multiple personality disorder, right? She's got multiple personalities in her head, some of which have access to her powers and others don't. And her powers change depending on which personality is taken over, right? So like telepathy or telekinesis or the ability to manipulate fire. Imagine Legion, but with far fewer personalities in his head and a far more limited breadth of power at his disposal. And that's basically Typhoid Mary, right? She's a mutant, essentially. And so because of this, the interest between the two and what's kind of intriguing is that one of the things Kingpin says is he kind of asks the question, like, why can't I stop doing this, right? Why hold on to these things that cause me nothing but pain? My hatred, my position, I'm so consumed by power and revenge, but I have you. I think our fiery beginning and how it gave way to something more powerful, more beautiful. I think back on the first time we made love after battle, and now I find I no longer need that battle to find that level of satisfaction. And so in the end, Typhoid says, like, I feel the same thing, right? I feel the same way. She says, even though I don't even really remember our first time, years of treatments and trauma have robbed me of so much, but I hold on to the feeling of when we were first together. And so Wilson Fisk in turn says, I wish we both had those memories. It doesn't feel fair. I wish you could remember. And he invokes the power of the Purple Man when he does, and Typhoid Mary remembers everything. She remembers everything about her own past. Now, she doesn't run from Wilson Fisk, right? She doesn't like leave him, right? It's just like she recalls everything. She's like, oh my God, what a gift. And so this is a whole change to the power of the Purple Man. Remember, the power of Zebediah Killgrave has only ever been used historically in Marvel Comics to dominate the wills of others. But here's something to understand. Here's something to keep in mind here. We only ever saw his powers used that way because he only ever used them that way. It wasn't as though Zebediah Killgrave was a guy who was trying to find a way to make the world a better place, and he just simply couldn't do it because his powers wouldn't let him, the guy's always been a dick, right? Like Zebediah Kilgrave has always just been a horrible human being who used his powers for like personal gratification and for the betterment of himself based on his own selfish desires. We've never seen an instance when anybody ever used the powers of the Purple Man to basically get other people to remember. And it kind of makes sense, right? If the Purple Man's powers, even if they're only by pheromone, can be used to make people do things and even make people believe things, then it would stand to reason the powers of the Purple Man can be used to make people remember things. And so in basically understanding that, right, and coming to that realization, Fisk says, like, I need air, right? I need space. The weight of years is crushing me. The weight of hate that I so desperately need to let go of. And he says, he literally holds this thing in his hand and says, remember. And this is when he recalls the identity of Matt Murdock as Daredevil. The question you really have to ask here is, what else is Wilson Fisk remembering? Because he is beset on all sides by deception and trickery and lies. So what's going to happen when he recalls everything that's actually the truth and realizes how much he's been lied to? I gotta tell you guys, this story just gets better and better. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.